I promise. Ow! Please, not my hand. Jesus! Jesus, don't get God, please, don't cut me.
Come on.
Ah! No! Please!
The images you have just seen are a very close representation of what happened in those dark years. The cruelty of Nazi soldiers against prisoners of war during World War II was as brutal as it was infamous. The Germans used any minor infraction as an excuse to beat, torture, or kill the captives. Anyone who dared to complain soon joined the pile of corpses formed by their former colleagues. One of the most macabre actions by the Germans was to organize sporting events solely for their entertainment. Among them were boxing matches, where well-fed Nazis dueled with hungry prisoners. Almost all of them ended with the same fatal result. The Allied soldier was beaten to death. But there were cases where the victims surprised the Germans and the entire world. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will witness the chronicle of Danny Finnegan, the English boxer who managed to thwart the intentions of the Nazis. Months of 1940, the entire world could feel the tension in the air. Adolf Hitler's Germany had conquered Poland, Norway, and Denmark in the previous months, and was now preparing for its next victim. But this time, its enemies were aware of its plans. The French army was considered one of the best on the planet. Not only did they outnumber the German forces, but they were also outmaneuvered, with more powerful tanks and more aircraft. And if that weren't enough, they weren't alone. The United Kingdom had sent the British Expeditionary Force with almost 400,000 soldiers to French territory to reinforce the defenses along the border with Germany. Among these men was Danny Finnegan. The young man was no stranger to combat, having gained fame in his homeland as a talented boxer, which had spread to other countries around the world. Now, however, he had to hang up his gloves and take up his rifle. Together with his squadron, he had been positioned on French soil, awaiting the Nazi offensive. And he did not have to wait long to see some action. On May 10, 1940, the forces of the Third Reich launched their massive invasion. They attacked not only France, but also Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg, in what was an ambitious joint operation that surprised the Allied commanders. Although they had fewer men and vehicles, the novel German techniques gave them the advantage in most of the engagements, and they soon managed to push their enemies back. The British and French could not conceive of the speed at which the German tanks could move, which were capable of traveling hundreds of kilometers in a single day. In this way, and through brutal battles, they managed to surround the Allied armies. Among them was Finnegan's squadron, which had suffered a large number of casualties due to the effectiveness of the Nazis. Quickly, their situation and that of all the defenders became desperate. By May 21st, with Belgium and Holland already out of the game, it was obvious that France could not hold out much longer. British leaders knew that if they did not evacuate their men, the Nazis would kill or imprison them. The possibility of losing the war was very real. So they ordered all their soldiers to head for the port of Dunkirk, where ships would be waiting to take them back to the United Kingdom. Finnegan and his comrades received the directive, but carrying it out would prove to be more difficult than they thought. While waiting for the opportunity to head for the evacuation point, they were ambushed by a German armored unit. Many of the men in the squadron were killed, with only a few managing to flee to a nearby village. A family of civilians, discovering that they were English soldiers, attempted to shelter them, but the Germans had been able to track them down. Such a transgression by French citizens was not easily forgiven by the conquerors.
Ausschlag! Blick nach vorne! You are now prisoners of the Reich!
Danny Finnegan and his comrades, now prisoners of war, were taken to a detention center near the village. This would serve as a temporary prison until they were sent to Germany, where any chance of escape would be completely gone. As the British died in their cells, the Nazi officer in charge of the camp, Captain Drexler, an avid boxing fan, recognized Finnegan's name in the report of new prisoners. Drexler, appealing to the power he had as a captor, approached the Englishman with a striking proposal. If Finnegan participated in fights against German soldiers in order to train the troops, he would receive favorable treatment in the detention center. Imagine being locked up, deprived of your freedom in enemy territory and not knowing if you would see the light of day. This was the scenario in which Finnegan had to make a decision. Without giving in to despair, Danny Finnegan tried to negotiate that the good conditions be extended to his comrades. However, the German made it clear that a prisoner was in no position to make demands. The Briton then, with remarkable fortitude, refused to serve as an object of amusement for his enemies. His honor was undeniable, but Drexler would not stop until he had achieved his goal and humiliated the English troops. Therefore, he followed up with a threat. If Finnegan did not accept the proposal, the Nazi officer would punish his squadmates. The Briton, with uncontrollable helplessness, had no choice but to accept the proposal. Even so, this was not enough for his captor. To ensure that his authority would not be challenged again, he ordered one of his men to brutally beat one of the prisoners. This event would remain etched in the minds of the Allies as the German soldier beat him to death. Although he had achieved his objective, Drexler had never thought of a fair fight. His intention was to demonstrate to the world the superiority of the Aryan race by defeating an Englishman in a physical confrontation. In addition, the food the captives had access to had little nutritional value. The protein that a boxer should consume was only allowed to Germans. To make matters worse, his rival greatly outweighed him. In any case, to ensure the Nazi victory, Drexler ordered Finnegan to throw himself to the ground in the 10th round. If the Briton decided to disobey him, the consequences could be terrible. The rest of the English comrades, however, did not sit back and wait for their fate. They immediately began to plan their escape. The detention camp was well protected, with watchtowers, machine guns, and snipers. Fleeing without a plan would mean certain death. They had to help themselves with a distraction. And there was none better than a boxing match. Captain Drexler would allow many of his guards to attend the duel, as he wanted everyone to witness the German superiority over the English. He would even invite the French civilians in the area to observe the fragility of their allies. These fights were the perfect opportunity to escape. However, the prisoners were not yet ready. They should plan their escape better, and in the meantime wait for another opportunity. Danny Finnegan's goal then was to survive until that opportunity came. But this would not be easy. His German rival had explicit orders to do everything possible to end his life. And although the British entered the ring with the idea of obeying Captain Drexler, his pride was stronger than his fear. But Danny was not the only one forced to defend his life with his fists. Boxing fights between enemies during World War II were a little known but very common occurrence within concentration camps. One of the most famous cases is that of Tadeusz Pietrzykowski, better known as Teddy. He was a Polish-Jewish boxer who took part in these fights in the most brutal of detention centers, Auschwitz-Birkenau. Tempted by the promise of better food rations in a place where food was barely enough to survive, he agreed to take part in the fights. His rivals were often German guards or Polish collaborators, whom he frequently defeated despite the disadvantages caused by the horrible conditions in which he was forced to live. Although some Nazis considered his victories to be dangerous as it could make them look weak, his fights were so entertaining that he was allowed to continue fighting. He was so fast that he was christened with the name of the White Fog.
Tadeusz Pietrzykowski tenía 20 años cuando comenzó a boxear. Tras la invasión de Polonia en 1939 por la Alemania nazi, intentó escapar a Francia, pero fue atrapado y enviado a Auschwitz. Allí comenzó a luchar para entretener a los nazis.
Tenía que hacer algo para poder salir del campo de concentración. Había acabado sus estudios, pero no tenía ninguna experiencia profesional. Lo único que podía hacer era boxear.
On certain occasions, he was forced to fight other Jewish prisoners for the delight of the guards. Many were malnourished, with barely any muscle mass. During these confrontations, Teddy adjusted his style to avoid hurting them, and at the same time put on a show entertaining enough so that no one was punished. His victories often raised the morale of his fellow prisoners and earned him the hatred of his captors. It was rumored that the guards were planning to kill him, but they never got the chance. His fame rose to such an extent that in 1943 it was decided to remove him from Auschwitz to other, much less brutal camps. He was transferred several times, continuing boxing matches in each new location. Thus, his winning streak continued until the end of the war, when the center in which he had been placed was liberated by the Allies. Teddy had managed to survive one of the bloodiest conflicts in humanity thanks to boxing. But Danny Finnegan was not so lucky. Although he had defeated his opponent, freedom was still a distant prospect. Now he had to suffer the wrath of Captain Drexler, who watched from the stands as his champion fell after a terrible beating. But although the Nazi officer had made it clear what would happen if the Englishman won the fight, the prisoner and his colleagues had an unexpected stroke of luck. Drexler's superior had arrived at the field, and being also a fan of the sport, he wanted to see Finnegan compete. The British were pardoned, and a new duel was scheduled. But the good news was short-lived. The day after the match, if the Allied soldier was still alive, he would leave for Germany with his comrades and his chances of freedom would disappear completely. Alarmed, the English knew they would have to speed up their escape plan. It had to happen no matter what during the next fight. Fortunately, they were not alone. A French citizen who had tried to shelter them in her home before they were captured had observed Finnegan during the match and offered her help. The plan was simple. In the next fight, while everyone was watching intently in the ring, she would bring them coats and civilian clothes with which they could sneak out. The guard would be minimal because of the fight. It was the perfect opportunity. Finnegan was to be dropped in the 5th round, and while he was escorted to the changing rooms by one of his companions, he had to find a way to escape. Although the Allied lines were not that far away, the plan was extremely risky. The chances of the escaped prisoners being spotted were very high, and what was certain was that if they were caught, they would not survive. But for Danny Finnegan, the danger was different. His opponent would be Maximus Sennenhund, a German who had been world heavyweight champion in 1934 and who outweighed him by almost 40 kilograms. The Briton had no chance of winning. All he could do was try to prolong the fight long enough to stall the Nazis and help his teammates escape before doing so himself. When the appointed day finally arrived and the referee rang the bell, Finnegan quickly learned how difficult his mission would be. Every blow from the German was like charging through a wall, while the Englishman's fists seemed to have no effect on his opponent. When the first round was barely over, Finnegan had to make an enormous effort not to faint. But he managed to resist. He knew that his teammates would only be able to flee if the fight dragged on long enough. When he was about to lose consciousness, a glimmer of hope returned to him. He saw the French citizen in the crowd and remembered what he had to do if he wanted to save his teammates. Little by little, as the fight continued and the crowd was absorbed in the ring, the Englishman received the articles of clothing and managed to slip away one by one. Finnegan kept his part of the deal and continued to fight despite the brutal blows he received. His bravery even impressed his rival. However, the Englishman was close to his breaking point. Taking advantage of the distraction, the last of the English soldiers went to check his escape route. It was then that he found himself in a terrible situation. The door through which he and Finnegan were going to escape had been walled up. His only hope had vanished. He quickly returned to the ring and took advantage of a pause in the fight to communicate the terrible news to the British boxer. The fighter understood that his fate was sealed, but not that of his partner. If he managed to continue the fight just a little longer, his comrade would be able to flee like the others had done. Accepting his fate, Danny Finnegan stood up once more and raised his fists.
Listen, you gotta get out of here now. I ain't leaving you. You've got to wait. Come on. Go. Let's stick it together, mate. We'll find another way out of Germany. Hey. You gotta let me win one on my own, mate. You ain't gonna win it. We already have, Billy. Fuck up. No. Billy. Covering fire. No. No.
The boxer held on as long as he could, until he was sure that the last of his allies had managed to escape. At that moment, Sennenhund delivered a fatal blow. As his eyes closed for the last time, Danny Finnegan smiled, knowing that his comrades were free. Although he had lost in the ring, the final victory had been his. This is how we get to the end of this video. The story you just heard is based on the film Behind the Line: Escape to Dunkirk by director Ben Mole, released in 2020. Finally, we want to ask you, what surprised you the most about this story? Leave us your answer in the comments box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.